Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
David Menzies for Rebel News here in Toronto. And folks, I'm at the Leaside location of Adamson Barbecue. We all know what happened to the Etobicoke location of Adamson Barbecue back in late November. And if you missed out on that one, in case you were in a cave somewhere, this is how Mayor John Tory and the Chief Medical Health Officer for the city, Eileen Davila, dealt with an illegal restaurant opening back then.
You have absolutely no legal authority to be here, and this is an unlawful thing, and everything you're doing here is going to blow up in your face. He's going to take it to court. What are you fucking pushing? Come on. Look at what they've started now. You're a hero, Adam. I love you guys. Move Small business.
So as you can see, a complete, in my opinion, overreach in terms of shutting down a restaurant. Quite literally, all the king's men and all the king's horses galloping in to shut down a little restaurant. Well, Adam Skelly, the proprietor, he is holding a press conference here, and it's likely about the court challenge that he has. So we're here. Lo and behold, there are several members of mainstream media here as well. And we're going to go in and see what Mr. Skelly has to say.
This never should have been escalated to a criminal matter. This was purely a civil matter, and there were avenues for the authorities to take to close my restaurant with a Section 9 order. Now, they eventually did. Justice Kimmel, who was the judge presiding over my case, granted that, but did not run that order through the charter. Now, recently in BC, the government was seeking an injunction against a church for reopening, and the judge in that case did run it through the charter, and he made reference to my case, saying that Justice Kimmel did not consider the charter when making her decision. I think that's kind of concerning that our authorities are doing that.
Why are you taking it to this level? Why are you going to court?
Because there's no other option. There's no end in sight. No real, I'm really struggling with that word today. No real world metric has been affected by this pandemic. There is no increase in deaths, and these alleged overflowing ICUs and hospitals, this is not a new issue. And if you look at the historical data, there's way less people in than usual. This tells me that the government is completely overreaching in an effort to close down small businesses and destroy our economy, and there seems to be a larger globalist agenda at play. The following is the legal basis for the constitutional question. Pandemic is a word that, if misused, can cause unreasonable fear or unjustified implementation of lockdown protocols and measures, leading to unnecessary suffering and death. Science is designed to inform policymakers, but when it is manipulated or falsified for ulterior motives, humanity as a whole suffers. In response to the COVID-19 virus, the governments have invoked extraordinary executive powers predicated on unsubstantiated scientific and legal grounds with catastrophic consequences to the people in Ontario, Canada, and indeed throughout the world. During the period from January 2020 to present day, the population throughout the country are witnessing the eradication of individual and collective rights in the name of protection of people's health. Evidence will demonstrate that the consequences of a lockdown are much more severe than the assumed pandemic. In the process, the rule of law has become the law of rule, where inherent rights and freedoms have become privileges. At this moment, it is very difficult to express that we all live in a free and democratic society. By any standard, international human rights and constitutional protection are all being eliminated to accommodate controlling people, to vaccinate them, all by the World Health Organization. The restrictions put in place by governments to impose draconian measures on its citizens without a scientific or medical rationale constitutes an abuse of human rights and a crime against humanity. The applicants, which is me, submit that Canada is in a state of constitutional crisis. Fundamental rights and freedoms are being usurped by federal, provincial, and municipal governments without constitutional authority or due process. The lawfulness and implications of these actions have yet to be reviewed on a constitutional basis. In that regard, the applicants submit the following constitutional questions to the courts for consideration. Now here's the 3 pillars of our legal challenge. Number 1, do the federal, provincial, and municipal governments have lawful constitutional authority to unequivocally adopt, adhere, and legislate in relation to the international recommendations and guidelines of the World Health Organization to declare a global pandemic without oversight and due process? Because that's what happened here. The World Health Organization said, there's a global pandemic, and our governments reacted. They took that at face value. There was no study that was done after that. They just took it at face value and locked us down because of recommendations from the World Health Organization. That's not the way it works here. There's rules in place where our legislature has to be involved to adopt these kind of measures. They didn't. They went around the legislature. There was no meetings in the legislature. This went directly to a provincial level, went around. This is actually point 2. If it's found that the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent emergency measures were lawful, despite the lack of oversight and due process, does the provincial government have constitutional authority under Section 91 of the Constitution Act to legislate the suspension of rights and freedoms with criminal law sanctions and dire emotional, financial, and health consequences for Ontarians on matters concerning the health and welfare of Canadians based purely on preventative concerns? So again, there is a federal emergency act that was avoided. They went right around it to a provincial level where provincial legislation was written, like the Reopening Ontario Act and the acts in the other provinces. And that's not our normal process here in Canada. And it was done that way intentionally to avoid any debate in the legislature. And if those 2 planks of evidence do not justify this Reopening Ontario Act being thrown away immediately, we can now fall back onto the charter. And we ask, are the applicants section, and by applicant, that's me in this case, but that's everybody in Ontario, are our sections 2, 7, 8, 9, and 15 of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms under the Canadian Charter infringed upon by the implementation and application of the preventative measures as legislated and applied? And if so, what is the infringement justified under Section 1? And as we proceed with the case, I think it's going to become very clear to everybody that that infringement is not justified at all. In regards to that first plank of evidence, the World Health Organization is not a faction in Canadian Parliament, part of the constitutional monarchy in Canada, or an institution governing the statutory or legal affairs of Canada. Thus, the World Health Organization has no authority to form the basis or proposal or inception of any action or legislation in Canada without due process. The second plank of evidence, if it is found that the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent emergency measures were lawful, despite the lack of oversight and due process, does the provincial government have constitutional authority under Section 91 of the Constitution Act to legislate the suspension of rights and freedoms, criminal law sanctions, and dire emotional, financial, and health consequences for Ontarians? We're challenging the Reopening Ontario Act in its entirety. We're going to be challenging all of the evidence that supports what's left of this pandemic narrative and whether or not it infringes on our charter.
When you enter into these kinds of situations, your legal team usually advises you of what your chances are. What chances have your legal team given you in having a sort of a favorable outcome in this?
Oh, it's without question, this one's in the bag. We're gonna win. We're following the structure of many successful legal challenges that have happened all around the world, in the States and overseas. We're challenging all the evidence with the same experts. So without a doubt, there is no evidence that's been shown to the general public that could be brought up in this court challenge that would give them a win.
And is there any precedence in Canada regarding a similar kind of move that you're making with your legal team?
No, not at all. This will be the most vast and broad challenge against the emergency orders in the country.
Also, the matter is there you being billed, I believe, almost $200,000 by the police for the amount of resources that was used to shut you down. Can you give us a status on that case?
Yeah, they sent me a demand letter for $187,000, and that was to cover the 250 police that were there that day on Thursday. I was told if I didn't pay that by December 31st, they'd be going to a Superior Court judge for an order demanding it, and they have not started that process yet, surely because they know that any reasonable judge will not grant them that order.
I'm wondering if one of the pillars in your arguments is that if we've seen what's happened in this pandemic, chief medical officers, the average person couldn't name their region or their city's chief medical officer. Suddenly these people have enormous power. They're unelected, they're unaccountable. I speak of someone like Dr. Ellen Davila here in Toronto. Is that problematic in that these people are enacting powers they were really never meant to enact in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's very strange to see how the power has shifted into the hands of public health officials, that decisions that affect our economy so dearly, it almost feels as if the politicians are pushing that off onto scapegoats at this point. That's the best explanation I have for it now.
Also, going back to November, I mean, it was certainly excessive. I mean, it was literally all the King's men and all the King's horses descending upon your Etobicoke restaurant. Adam, was the unspoken strategy here by the likes of Dr. Davila and Mayor Tory to make an example out of you, to send a message to any other retailer, gym owner, restaurateur, that if you dare have the temerity to open up, guess what? You're going to be on the 6 o'clock news. Guess what? The mounted units coming to your door. You're going to be led off in handcuffs as you were into a police cruiser. Was that them trying to quell any kind of, I guess, retail rebellion before it even began?
You know, I don't have any conversations with Doug Ford and John Tory. As hard as I've tried, they've never got back to me, so I can only make assumptions. And I was out there every day telling people, giving them suggestions. My bail conditions prohibit me from probably repeating those words now. That's how badly they don't want me to say those words. But you can look back to our previous interviews to see what I was saying those days. I think that's safe. My lawyer's not here, so I think that's probably not a bail breach. I think that's pretty obvious, Dave. They escalated from a civil to a criminal matter despite having several legal avenues they could have done to have me stop. Sending 253 police officers, that was the biggest show of force we've seen in Canada since the G20. I think it's pretty obvious the message that they were trying to set, and the subsequent media smear campaign calling me a racist and white privilege and all these other things that come with that when you challenge the establishment. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that was a show of force to make sure that nobody else opened up in protest.
How is it explained that big box stores can operate with impunity with such huge numbers, and yet the government and the bureaucracy is going after the little guy?
I'd say that this is a fear and intimidation strategy, which is the only strategy that the authorities have left, all in regards to the use of masks. They want to make sure that that symbol of our loss of freedom of speech is plastered all over our face every day. And anywhere where you would go to possibly remove that thing, for example, for a while it was at the dentist, it was when you go to the hair salon, when you go in and eat at a restaurant, all those kind of things were shut down. They have sent bylaw, police, fire, just about every day since November, we've had guys, the authorities from the city, walking in and out of my place, parked outside, parked across the street. I would hate to guess how much tax dollars has been spent trying to find some issues to shut me down here.
Well, there you have it, folks. Adam Skelly and his legal team is essentially challenging the Reopening Ontario Act. I can never get that past me without a chuckle. The Reopening Ontario Act, when everything is actually being closed down. It's Orwellian doublespeak at its finest. But basically, the position is that the Reopening Ontario Act is unconstitutional, that this was never debated in the legislature, that the World Health Organization is given too much precedence in terms of Canadian affairs. And there is no legal precedence for this, according to Adam. So this is uncharted legal territory. But that is the accusation. And we're going to have to see if a judge buys that argument when it is indeed heard in Superior Court in the months ahead. And of course, you can bet Rebel News will be there to report that court battle. For Rebel News, I'm David the Menzoid Menzies. Well, folks, we have seen how brutalized Adam Skelly has been in terms of opening his restaurant. Have you been brutalized too? Have you got one of those maybe $880 Wuhan virus tickets? If so, please go to fightthefines.com. That's fightthefines.com. Tell us your story, and if we think it has merit, we'll put you in touch with a top-notch criminal lawyer and crowdfund your legal fees.